In this series, the White Ox follows Dr. Madigan's original 1939 Simpson Desert Expedition, from the old Andado station in the west to Birdsville in the east. This is already the longest and most difficult crossing of the Simpson, but on this particular trip, we had a new element playing havoc with all of our best laid plans.
Water. And plenty of it.
Still, as Madigan himself would say, adventures are a sign of incompetence. Will the wheels fall off and the vehicles end up dug to their axles? Or will we find a way through? Join us as we attempt to negotiate some of the wettest desert track conditions we've ever experienced. Before we begin the Madigan, we head into iconic Dalhousie, about 250 kilometres south of Andado, on the western edge of the French line. So Dalhousie Springs, up here on the edge of the Simpson Desert, like a beautiful oasis. These artesian waters, they can be up to 3 million years old, and at the source the water comes out at a balmy 43 degrees. These springs are not fed or do not feed into any other tributaries or creeks or rivers around, so they're isolated. And there are some fish species and some little yabbies and things in here that only exist in this tiny little ecosystem that sort of exists unto itself. And you could only imagine coming across after the remote country we've been in, through those hot, dusty, dry giver plains and those dry creek beds that probably only get water down them once in a blue moon, and heading towards even more remote and wild desert country, to come across this little hot spring oasis out here is just pretty amazing. Dalhousie is well known, and this is on the route between here and Birdsville if you're doing the French line. In fact, it's one of many springs. In fact, there are 80 such mound springs in this area, which is just basically funneling up artesian water, perfect for swimming. It's the perfect depth, it's the perfect temperature. If you're a bit soft like me and you like your water nice and warm. Just a short trip from the springs are the ruins of the old Dalhousie homestead. So you can see here behind me the ruins and the remnants of a couple of date palms here. This would have been like a little oasis in the desert really for the homesteaders, but actually date palms were grown here in large volumes as an experimental crop. So the story goes. These are the only ones left. They've been subsequently removed. Like most things, it was white people trying to impose their will on the environment really, and introducing all sorts of species of things that don't belong. But those are one that are, unlike rabbits maybe, and pigs and toads and foxes, it's a little bit easier to remove the date palms. Here we are, Mount Dare. This is such an iconic outback pub. Where else would you rather be? Deep in the heart of Toyota country. Getting a bit of fuel here in Mount Dare, but we are going to stay the night. We'll fuel up, top up our water, pitch up camp, even though it's pretty early. We'll stay here at the Mount Dare pub and then bright and early on the road tomorrow and into Andado.
Just past the old Andado homestead is Mac Clark's Acacia Pierce Reserve. The area has been fenced off to protect the approximately 1,000 trees of this very rare species. Also known as the waddy tree, this species has been used by the traditional owners for thousands of years and is highly prized for its incredibly dense and hard timber. Unfortunately, it was also highly prized by the pastoralists who later came to settle these areas. They used this tree extensively for stock fencing and shelters and the like. As a result, very little of it is left. In fact, there are only 3 stands remaining in the whole of Australia today. This one here at Andado, another at Birdsville, and one more near Boulia. Having finally made it to the start of the Madigan line, we were forced to retreat to Alice Springs, as my recently purchased Optima Redtop, supposedly a top-of-the-line battery, failed. We were able to start the Ox in the meantime using the excellent iTech World JS80 Jumpstarter pack, and could have even continued this way through the desert if we'd had to. I guess this highlights just how critical it is to have backup systems when travelling remote, as even new components can and do fail. Being a purely mechanical engine, the 1HZ requires very little electrical power, if any, once it's up and running. Yet another reason why these old engines are so great for the bush. They're much less complex when compared to modern diesels. We made the 300km plus trip via the bins track to Alice Springs and replaced the battery with a new product, this time from Century. Unfortunately, the 2 or 3 day delay and the return via the bins track meant we were now caught in some unfavourable conditions. However, we decided to push on, figuring that things could only get drier as we got closer to the desert itself. Well, we're still trekking on, but it's getting dark, and in this kind of weather and track conditions we don't want to be driving in the dark, so we're going to find the first decent spot to pull up anywhere is good. We're about 80 k's from Andado, and we're hoping that overnight we get a bit of breeze, that the sky clears, and it might just be dry enough to tentatively make our way towards Andado tomorrow. So here we are on the bins track. Actually, it used to be known as the old Andado track because that's where it goes. And we got, look at this for a luxury campsite. We're living the dream. It's but still, you know, I was going to say at least we've got under 1 million stars, but we don't even have that.
It's only flat.
But have a look at the state of these rigs. They're almost as dirty as the drivers. Anyway, stream living. What do you think so far, Brad?
Should have washed the car in Alice before we come out here.
Yeah, you should have cleaned it before you came out. What were you thinking? Bringing it out in this state.
Look at the tail lights oozing.
Yeah. It's not great to do to the tracks, and I don't like doing it, but it's working. We've got to stay on the high side because it's muddy and slippery down there. It's not good to be in the spin effects and shit, but it's the only way we can find traction, really, and that's at the moment. Straddling the
Acacia Grove. It represents basically the beginning of the Madigan line from there, in a sense. You head east from there, you're into the first camp, and it's now 11:15. A couple of days after we were already here, and we are finally back. That was a hell of a detour, really, though, for the sake of a battery. That just shows you what this place can do and how much you really need to be able to rely on your gear, because really this battery's cost us the extra few days, but also the fuel, and probably more importantly just the going just got so much worse. The rains, we would have beat the rains across into the Simo, but now we had to come back through the bins, and it's all wet, and these places get pretty shitty, and there's just mud absolutely everywhere, which kinda, when you're living in a vehicle, it's not ideal. It's not like we can just duck down to the pressure washer, clean it all off. It's going to be on there for who knows. Scrape as much of it off as we can by hand. Probably got a half a ton of mud, extra weight payload. Anyway, so it's annoying, all that for a fucking battery, but it had to be done.
After a very long and unexpected detour, and having endured the bins track at its very worst, or best, depending on your point of view, we finally descended on the old Andado homestead. The place where it all began. Cecil Thomas Madigan was born in Renmark, South Australia in 1889. He was an Oxford University Rhodes Scholar, but deferred when Sir Douglas Mawson selected him as part of the Australasian Antarctic expedition. Despite being considerably younger and less experienced than the old man, as he referred to Mawson, Madigan soon proved to be highly skilled in leadership, navigation, and survival. Conditions were extreme. The site of the base selected, Commonwealth Bay, is said to be the windiest location on Earth, its fierce winds regularly blowing in excess of 200 kilometres an hour. Remarkably, they managed to complete the building of a hut from which to base their expeditions. The whole saga culminated with one final reconnaissance, during which Mawson and Madigan took two separate but roughly parallel routes following the coast to the east. Madigan brilliantly and successfully navigated almost 300 miles of uncharted coastline and returned to the ship Aurora on January 16, 1913, just in time for its departure. But there was no sign of Mawson or his two companions, Ninnis and Mertz. After an agonising 3 weeks, the ship could no longer remain in port due to the onset of the winter ice. Madigan made the courageous and honourable decision to wait behind in case Mawson was still alive. He was. Mere hours after the Aurora had set sail on the 8th of February 1913, Madigan looked to the snow-covered horizon to see a lone figure staggering towards him. It was Mawson. Ninnis and Mertz were lost. One had starved, the other had fallen down a crevasse. Both deaths were the direct result, in Madigan's view at least, of incompetent leadership. Madigan was inconsolable. He held Mawson personally accountable for the deaths of two of his friends. It must have been a very long winter in Antarctica that year, as the two men waited out the hellish conditions for 11 months until the Aurora could finally return. In December of that year, the Aurora did return. The two men had survived, but the damage was done. "I can never respect Mawson," Madigan wrote, "for reasons which I cannot put down in this book. However, I must grin and bear his authority for the present."